Is up, IB history students? I hope that this slideshow finds you well. We're doing a little house painting, a little uh, remote learning planning, so we got that going on. Anyway, we got the afternoon coffee too, which is super important. Anyway, I am going to finish up apartheid and kind of give you the epilogue about how it ended and then where did we go from here. I think also, hopefully you've been looking through the various different resources that I've given you about how apartheid started, and then the different examples of discrimination, and then the various ways that the anti-apartheid groups tried to rise against and end the apartheid regime that was in power. So this is the epilogue, the end of apartheid. I'm going to start somewhere around 1961, where the last overview reading you had left off. You might also have a little bit more information about this related to the Rivonia trial. But 1961, the African National Congress decided to launch sabotage campaigns. So not necessarily for the first time, but for the first time that it was officialized, at least, they started to move towards a more armed resistance strategy, as opposed to just the nonviolent passive resistance that or civil disobedience that you saw with things like the Defiance campaign and also bus boycotting and things like that. So it was part of a broader strategy. They didn't abandon nonviolent action altogether, but they also were trying to reach out to the rest of the world and try to isolate the South African government and find ways to get diplomatic action against them in order to persuade the South African government to abandon its apartheid laws. And then the African National Congress, the ANC, organized a subgroup which was called MK, or Spear of the Nation, which was headed by Nelson Mandela in 1961. And they launched 200 plus attacks over the next 18 months on government buildings, on industries, on transportation outlets. So anything that they felt like was the face of the apartheid regime, they were launching attacks of sabotage on it. So I got a little news clipping from that. This is their symbol, Spear of the Nation, or MK, and then I've got a little picture right behind me of some of the militants. So much more militant, much more armed, and not abandoning completely this nonviolent position, but resorting to armed resistance when necessary. The Rivonia Trial was a key turning point in kind of quashing the movement for a while. So in 1962, the South African government passed the Sabotage Act, which was another apartheid law that gave the government a lot of broad power to arrest anyone who they believed was threatening the security of the country. So it's very similar to something like an Espionage and Sedition Act, but also something that was going to try to stop what they felt was terrorism in their country. This was also accompanied by, very closely following it, the 90-Day Act, which basically just stated that the government, if they arrested you under the Sabotage Act or any other criminal act, they could hold you for 90 days without charging you with any crime at all or any type of resolution to your case. And also it could be enforced multiple times. So you had these leaders that would be arrested, held for a month or for 3 months, and then released just to be rearrested under the Sabotage Act, and then held for another 90 days over and over and over again, without any way for these leaders to be able to have some kind of recourse for what's happening to them. So this kind of led to South Africa just drifting further and further toward becoming a police state in the 1960s. In July 1963, 9 members of the ANC leadership, including Nelson Mandela, were supposedly caught plotting a sabotage expedition, and they were held and put on trial in Rivonia, which is why this is where it gets its name from. And in 1964, Mandela and 7 others were sentenced to life in prison. Originally, they were charged with death. There was a huge international outcry against the Rivonia trial that was going on. A lot of countries in the UN Security Council passed a resolution saying that they wanted the Rivonia trial disbanded, and then they wanted the people that were being charged to be given amnesty. Coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, if you think about what's going on in the 1960s in the U.S. at this time, the U.S. didn't vote. They abstained from voting or putting their name on that resolution, along with a few other countries. So Mandela's put in prison for life. He spends about 27 years there, and despite the urgings of the UN Security Council, South Africa becomes increasingly authoritarian throughout the rest of the 60s and 70s. So this is a kind of a time, not necessarily that the movement's done or they're not active, but you don't see a lot of really significant action done by anti-apartheid movements, mostly because a lot of their leaders, significant leaders, were put in prison at this time. In the 70s, though, kind of coinciding with the Black Power movement, in fact, it was inspired by the Black Power movement. You had the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, which was founded by Steve Biko, who it's very similar to Black Power, but thinking about increasing rights to end separate development, but without the help of whites. So kind of this Black separatist movement where they just want to do their own thing, and they want to escape discrimination, and they feel like they don't need the help of white people to do that. They don't want to feel like they're being victimized, but they also want to have their rights restored. So it won a lot of followers, especially younger Blacks. So this is a college student movement, or a movement by the youth as well in South Africa, and which a continuity throughout this time in apartheid is if the South African government doesn't like something that you're doing, especially if it goes against the apartheid regime, they tend to just make what you're doing illegal. So they banned the movement in 1977, which allowed them to throw people in prison. But key turning point in terms of the atmosphere of the movement, especially after it kind of reached this lull during the late 60s and early 70s. Also, you see some worldwide shifts going on that are actually happening both within South Africa and outside of South Africa, but the economy was actually growing, and because of that, it led to some effects that made apartheid start to become seen as much less than ideal to the South African government. So as the economy grew, you needed more and more workers and more laborers, and what was happening was because of these separation laws that kept racial minorities just completely separate from whites in South Africa, they started to have a labor shortage. So they had to find, if they wanted their economy to keep growing and become one of those like first world or second world countries, they had to find ways to give racial minorities more rights and allow them to participate in the economy more. So this started to actually, I don't want to say necessarily naturally, but just over time, without necessarily a confrontation between the movement and the government, led to the status of Blacks and other racial minorities in South Africa to actually increase as the economy grew. In addition, contextually around this time, you also had a variety of independence movements throughout Central Africa that were deposing white leadership, and these countries were surrounding South Africa as well, and replacing them with Black regimes. So what happened was you had these possible safe havens for anti-apartheid movements where they could go to another country and then be active in that country and operate out of that country and have safety while they were there. So you had these safe havens for the Pan-African Conference and also the African National Congress, which then you also had this support from countries surrounding South Africa as well. Eventually, the South African police and military, just because of the rebellion that was occurring and the ability to have these safe havens in other countries, they just could not keep up with the rebellion and doing their jobs. So basically, this kind of led to reform initiatives by the government. In fact, one thing they had to do was they had to start allowing Black Africans to be on the police force, who are supposed to be enforcing these laws, which make no sense whatsoever, which led to the increasing status of Blacks in South Africa. We'll get a little bit more into that because that did cause some conflict between anti-apartheid movements and what they saw as being like sympathizers with the government as well. You also had the increasing power of Black union organization. As the economy was growing, workers started to get more power and you had more union activity. So you had the Congress of South African, I can't remember what the heck it was. I apologize. Let me check that out for a second. Sorry about that. I took a little bit of a pause there so I could make sure I said the name correctly. So this is the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So getting together, increasing the status of Black Africans in the workforce as well. So they became gaining more and more power economically. In the 1980s, you see this return to increasing, not a return necessarily, because there still was a lot of violence going on, but you see an increase in violence in the 1980s to a great extent. So the government declared a state of emergency in 1985 following Black deaths during peaceful protests that were going on. The protests against both the government and Black betrayers. So people, like I mentioned slide earlier, these Blacks that were on the police force that the anti-apartheid movement felt like was being sympathetic to the government, they would often get pretty brutal resistance against them. So one common way was, sorry about that, necklacing, which is where these anti-apartheid demonstrators or operatives would get these Black police officers, and they would put like a tire around their head and then light it on fire and let them burn to death. So just these extremely like brutal, violent insurrections that were going on. You also had increasing MK attacks throughout the 1980s on what they considered to be soft targets, so targets where they were likely to not necessarily kill a lot of people, but also not see a lot of resistance against the government when they were doing this. So bus stations and restaurants were very common ones, and the government reacted like they were expecting them to, with further repression, and actually encouraged vigilante action on the part of Black collaborators. So paying people and finding members of the Black community that they could influence to go against the anti-apartheid movement in vigilante action. And the country just kind of seemed at this time, as the international community is looking on, as being just headed toward an all-out civil war between the anti-apartheid activists and the South African government. So finally, you get to this point of liberation. So violence during the state of emergency attracted the attention of a lot of other nations, including finally in the 1980s, the US really getting involved. There was a worldwide oil and arms embargo. So the entire rest of the world decided, or at least the developed world decided, that they would stop exporting oil and weapons to South Africa because of what was going on there. Some countries, including the US, refused to buy certain products from South Africa, so kind of putting a lot of economic sanctions on the country during the state of emergency that was going on. And in August 1989, there was a new president who was elected. His name was F.W. de Klerk, and he, even though he was part of the National Party, he believed that apartheid was becoming less and less viable as time was going on. He was kind of on a reform mindset and decided that he was going to get rid of a lot of these laws. So one of the first things he did in 1990 when he took power was he released Mandela from prison. So Mandela had been doing this life sentence for going on 27 years at this point, and they released him from prison. They also removed the ban on various anti-apartheid groups. So a lot of those groups have been banned or driven underground. So they removed that, let them operate more actively in society without fear of violent repression. And then radical Blacks still called for immediate change. So this wasn't like everybody was really, people were excited about this movement, but also people felt like it wasn't happening quick enough, which is often the case with the radical actors during a revolution. So in 1991, de Klerk removed many key apartheid laws. So a lot of these petty apartheid laws, and also some of the removal policies with the grand apartheid legislation were removed. Violence continued as different groups vied for power. So now you had these various anti-apartheid groups that were trying to become the leading political party in South Africa, and there was kind of some internal violence that was going on amongst the anti-apartheid movement. But a lot of these laws were being repealed. Nelson Mandela, key figurehead, idol of the movement, is released from prison. And then eventually you get to a post-apartheid South Africa. So the government and anti-apartheid groups agreed to create a new constitution together, and it's actually considered to be one of the most democratic constitutions in the world. It protects members of all races, ethnic groups, religious and sexual orientations, and genders. And in 1994, new voting rights allowed all 4 of the old racial categories to vote for the first time. So everybody was allowed to vote, tried to have universal suffrage, and Nelson Mandela was elected president. He had also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, but in 1994, he's elected president of South Africa. He just passed, it seems like it wasn't that long ago, but in 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away, but seen as one of the prime figures in not only Black rights, but South African rights and human rights throughout the globe. Shortly after that, they established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, and they had families not only from racial minority groups, but also people that faced violence at the hands of the anti-apartheid groups that testified, and they received reparations payments, which amounted to about $3,900 per family. I'm not really keen on like how all of it was calculated. If you're interested in that, check it out and let us know. But that's kind of wrapping up the end of apartheid. Now, what I would like you to do is check out the New York Times article that I have, because they have a article they did. I think it was in 2018, but it's like 25 years post-apartheid. What is South Africa like today? Are they truly becoming as democratic as their constitution would suggest? And it kind of goes into our theme of revolutions, about what is actually accomplished during these times. So thank you for listening. I appreciate all your work and effort, and try to stave off the senioritis a little bit longer.